Hi, I'm John Atack, and I'm extraordinarily pleased to welcome my friends, Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall. And I wanted to talk about the course you've been running. How many years is it now?
Oh,
In our
5 years.
fifth year.
Wow. And I remember when it started, and just like the first in the world, fancy that being the first in the world, a master's degree in coercive control. So tell me a little bit about your progress thus far and what you're doing.
Can I go back to the beginning for a second?
Get back to the beginning, yes.
So it's actually the psychology of coercive control.
Okay.
And we were interested in the underlying things that happen with the mind across a whole variety of contexts where people are coercively controlled. And we were very excited that the Serious Crime Act passed in the UK and that coercive control is now a serious crime. It was fantastic news. So it was like a dream we'd had for a long time to do more in education, but that seemed like the right time, like people were starting to understand. But what I wanted to say was that we spent a year putting together the course and validating it through the university processes at the University of Salford. But it was just our dream. And we didn't know if anyone would be interested in coming. And that's my favorite memory of the very beginning was the first day, the first class. We went to the classroom, we looked out, and there were people there. And I turned to Rod and I said, they came. And it was our field of dreams moment. If you build it, they will come. And they keep coming. And, especially in the beginning, I thought maybe that's it. That is the sum total of people in the world that want to take a program like this. And they heard about it and they came, and that will be it. And every year more people came. And since we've become distance learning, we've been able to open it up tremendously and accommodate a lot more people.
And you do now have people from all over the world. You're saying, Malaysia.
We do.
Fantastic. That's exactly what we want, to reach as many people as possible.
And that's why we went to distance learning, because we had numerous people come to us saying they would love to come on the program, but they couldn't afford to move to the UK. Or to the northwest of England as well, because we had a number of people in different parts of the UK who couldn't do that either. And so this has really opened up the program. We have students from North America, different parts of Europe, Middle East. We have a student out in Malaysia currently as well. So it's been fantastic to have that geographical breadth, and we embraced the online world for positive reasons. So we didn't do it because of the pandemic. I mean, it was during the pandemic we chose to move to online, but that was really, in a sense, a happy coincidence. And since then, it's just been great to have conversations at all times of the day and night about coercive control.
Indeed.
Who needs to sleep?
Exactly.
So. And I've talked with several of your students over the years, one way and another, and there have been some, for me, very exciting projects. For example, a dissertation talking about exit counselling within authoritarian cult groups as it might be to de-radicalisation.
Yeah.
And we've all three of us attempted to do something about that. But it seems to me there are so many fields where this coercive control is relevant to all organizations. Wherever there are groups of people, we need to, balance things out and make sure that these principles are understood. So what other stories do you have? Who else have you dealt with that what other subject areas has this moved into?
The great thing about the program is it gives people the opportunity to explore how coercive control works across those range of settings, whether it's in cults or extremist radical groups, whether it's in abusive relationships, whether it's in gangs, organized crime, trafficking, organizations more broadly. And so what we found is that students come to us with an area of interest that's sometimes inspired by personal experience or things that they've observed happening to others, around them, sometimes family members, or it may be a professional interest that they've been working for many years in one of those fields and they want to research that area more broadly. So, we've got students who've looked at trafficking, both researching how that's affecting people directly or looking at research that's been done on it. We've got a student at the moment that's, investigating coercive sex work, for example, and we've had students looking also at authoritarianism in the context of religious groups. And so there's been a whole range of projects, and it's that diversity that's really important. But coercive control is a unifying concept, explaining the changes that take place psychologically so that people can recognize when it's happening to other people, but also when it's happening to you yourself, and being able to, in a sense, intervene further upstream. So we've really found the ability to be able to just spread that message. I mean, I did research years ago with the late Paul Martin at the Wellspring Retreat and Resource Centre, where we identified from the research that we did there that the psychological transformation that people go through, we termed it totalistic identity, the way that the group or the person takes you over psychologically, that is associated with psychological distress. I mean, that was the largest study that showed that empirically to be the case. And our theory arose out of that data. And we've been able to then match that data with new scientific evidence that's being developed around the effect of trauma on people long term and the way that binds people psychologically to the abuser or to the group. And the ability of people to reflect on that, to educate themselves about what's happened to them. And therefore, really, for us, this course is a way of engendering social change. I mean, we really want people to take that knowledge, to take those skills and really have an impact. And we've been so pleased to see not only existing professionals come on the program, but also new professionals go out into the field, because that's what we desperately need. All of us in the field of helping people who've been affected by harmful groups or harmful people, we always say there aren't enough of us in the field. And we just hope that this program and other programs like it, because we want there to be a program in every town or every country, not just our program. We really want this to be a movement that starts to really educate people more broadly and create a new generation of skilled practitioners across different disciplines who can really have that impact in the generations to come.
I think it's a very important point that I've always felt, that I wanted to start people thinking and doing something rather than becoming the messiah, and sort of the grand authority, which I'm not. And that idea of putting it in every town, and firstly putting it on every continent would be probably not Antarctica, but there's so much that's about critical thinking, and there's been such a push at this idea of that if people just think straight, then they'll be fine, and only weak and vulnerable people are ever taken in by anything. And there's that other element of it, which, as you say, is the psychological changes that take place. Remember a forensic psychologist called Brian Tully, who I invited to talk back in the 80s, which ended up at the Royal College of Surgeons for some reason, because Lady Daphne Vane had a connection there. And I was fascinated by his talk. He first of all, he came on and he said, I'm up on the stage, so I'm the authority figure. If anybody wants to interrupt, please do. And as I'd just been told to shut up by the professor who talked before him, I applauded that. But he then said that in his work, which was with white collar criminals, that largely what happened were kind of increments of dissonance. So that somebody was a lawyer and their boss had come in and said, oh, could you backdate that contract to yesterday? And once you'd taken this one step, and it's like the induction into the mafia or some gang, that we just do this little thing, or we'll tell on you now because we know about it. And he said that he'd find this, this person would be sobbing by the end of the interview saying, how did this happen? I just made this one mistake and then I couldn't escape from it. And I think we live in a society which has broadly accepted exploitative persuasion, coercive control. There's a cynicism, the way that public relations works, that spin doctors boast about how they've tricked the public into voting for their political bosses, which has made this so much more necessary in our time. The inferences are incredible. How about getting this into the school system? Do you have any thoughts about, how that might be done?
So should I go first? I've been a school governor for over 20 years. I'm currently a governor of a primary school in Derby, and I'm also a director with the Northern Schools Trust in Merseyside. And in both cases, I know other people are doing some important work in this area too. There's ongoing discussions and examples of where we've been able to think about how can we introduce into the curriculum in different ways opportunities for students to think more critically, particularly around issues to do with science and knowledge, and the notion that one should just not be accepting knowledge uncritically, but also looking for a proper evidence base for it, which kind of gets us into the territory of conspiracy theories and the whole kind of anti-vaxx movement or the climate change skeptics and all of that. And that's, another area that we cover on the program, because that's about, how do we equip new generations of people to be able to discern, exactly.
The anti-vax movement.
Exactly.
Yeah, sorry. Couldn't help it. It was right there.
I'm afraid there's a lot of it out there, to put it very mildly indeed. And, I haven't even mentioned QAnon yet. So, the point is that there's lots of material, way too much, actually. But the ability then to get in on the ground with young people is really, really important. I agree. But Linda, you were going to come in.
I was just going to say that our students come from a broad variety of backgrounds and work interests, and some of them are in education. So they do take that knowledge that we give them and share that at whatever level they're teaching, which has tended to be not primary school yet, but that could happen any day. But it's tended to be secondary and further education and higher education. But importantly also, some of our students have talked to us about the role of education in their own recovery from an abusive experience, that education alone was healing and restorative. And even learning about coercive control with us has been described to us by some of our students as something that helped move them along further in the recovery. So the problem is we're whole human beings. So we're our minds, but we're our hearts and our feelings and our spirits too. So if you only work on critical thinking, you're not going to solve the problem, because people aren't thinking critically when they fall in love with a group or a movement or an ideal or a leader. But it's part of the healing is thinking critically. And of course, we teach that in every master's program in the universities, how to think critically. So we can build on that and use that to help people to see, what is the science of things? What is an evidence base? It's not just because you found it on an internet site. And we're constantly challenging students to be critical of things that we say, challenge us, dispute it. Let's have a debate about things. And that's really important. But it's also important to help people to heal emotionally. And the main thing that tends to happen there is that people's emotions get constricted by the coercive environment, where they no longer have all their feelings. They're shut down. They're blindly following along now. They're living out of fear of displeasing their leader or the person they're in relationship with. And it's about reclaiming yourself as a whole human being, and that you can have ambivalent feelings. You don't just have to be loyal to something, and you can be happy and you can be sad the next moment, and you can be so relieved that you're out of an abusive relationship. At the same time, you can miss it and need to grieve.
And what you're describing there, Linda, is of course trauma coerced attachment, and that concept of the way in which people form trauma bonds with others, whether it's the group leader or an abusive partner, very much relates to the concept of totalistic identity, the way that one's identity is subsumed by the other in a way that's quite traumatic. It's abusive, but at the time, the person feels that they're doing it voluntarily, and that in fact their behavior for the other person or for the group feels good to them because it's reinforcing that part of their identity, the dominant part that is subsumed by the group or the other person. And it's how you help people to snap out of that, which of course is what we do in exit work. You know, those of us like yourself, John, that have done that work over many years, you know, that's the difficulties, how, but recognizing more and more how that process works and getting that message out is absolutely critical, because that helps, I think, people to see it further upstream and to then help people more effectively, you know, whether it's people in abusive relationships or people, say, that get recruited, you know, to organizations like ISIS, you know, and understanding, you know, the transformation that's taken place with Shamima Begum is really important, because, you know, the Shamima who's on the media now is not the same person who was recruited into ISIS or that was part of ISIS. And it's important to recognize the changes that people go through psychologically and to really support their recovery.
But her case also shows how the whole society needs to be more understanding, because she's been villainized when she was basically a child that was groomed and systematically manipulated to leave this country and to become an ISIS bride. And there are many people that have no compassion for that whatsoever. I mean, what does that say about our misunderstandings as a society?
Yeah, I mean, when we were at, I think it was Lisbon, the Radicalization Awareness Network meeting, there was a young Afghani woman who, in fact, at the age of 8, I think, had gone to Denmark, a family. And when she was about 16, she told me that, you know, she was being radicalized. And so her father had said, go and live in Afghanistan for 6 months, you know, see what the reality is. And she came back, and she was now, while this country was taking passports away from people who were trying to come home, in Denmark, with the Aarhus Project and other aspects, they were seeking to care for these people and help them. And to me, the thought that you're going to leave, what, at least 800 people who left this country stateless, they're probably going to resent this. And as you say, with the girls, and they were often sort of 15 and 16-year-old girls who were tricked into this, they were certainly not told the truth of what would happen to them. And they then find themselves, you know, oh, well, your husband's been killed, here's another husband. And yes, so the attack on the victims, the lack of compassion is absolutely shocking to me. And the enormity of it, what's been created, that when 9/11 happened, there were 479 people in the 4 organizations that were called Al-Qaeda. The response to it within 2 years had created 35,000 members. And we've now just seen the Taliban basically take the weapons from a modern army of 300,000 people. And that's the eventuation of the whole campaign, that they've been fully armed to do whatever it is they're going to do next. The policy has just been, it has been this sort of aggressive, polarized, hateful policy, rather than saying we're all human beings, we're all subject to the same pressures and demands. There are those among us, a small quantity of them. Robert Hare reckons about 2% of people are psychopaths, but a small percentage of people who seem to get into positions of power, malignant narcissists and what have you, and then affect policy. And that policy is often based upon revenge rather than upon consequences, rather upon saying, well, what will happen if, you know, if we sack all of the Republican Guard, will they then become ISIS? Yes, they will. And the thought that they were able to take so much territory, well, they were a fully trained army who lost all political power because the Shiites took all control in Iraq. And these ridiculous and unthought through behaviors, because of dogmatic belief, which I always come back to, that yes, people follow supposedly charismatic leaders, though the ones I've met have never been charismatic, I must say, but who are afforded charisma.
Yes.
But they come to believe certain ideas, and they believe them fanatically and thoroughly, and are willing to die for them. And so the idea of Dar al-Islam, that the caliphate must extend to its former boundaries, well, that would mean that Spain has got to be given back to Islam. It would mean that everything up to the boundaries of Hungary would have to, that they're fighting for a situation that existed long ago, as if it were a sensible thing to do. And that fanaticism, and it was fanaticism that fascinated me, that this, how do you get somebody to do things that are against their own interests and against the interests of the rest of humanity? My own recent study has been of neo-Nazis, and I am just absolutely floored. I wanted to understand, what is this idea of the Aryan race? Where does this come from? And I didn't know that it was Madame Blavatsky, the famous plagiarist and con artist, and that she decided that Atlantis, and I think that Plato is the only person who ever mentioned Atlantis, and it was probably Crete he was talking about in the tsunami, but that Atlantis had been populated by the Aryans, and who had supernatural powers, apparently. I didn't know this. And they'd interbred, miscegenated with the Lemurians, another lost continent. And the consequence was the Nordic races. And when you get into the origins of Nazism, the Ariosophists, the Theozoologians, what they are saying is that with a proper breeding program, we'll have superpowers again. And this is ridiculous. But of course, the Lebensborn program and I don't remember what her name is, but the dark-haired woman in ABBA was a Lebensborn child, where Heinrich Himmler, founder and head of the SS, head of the Gestapo, Ministry of the Interior, and head of the Ahnenerbe Ministry, which had 50 divisions researching the truth of these Aryan ideas. The universities were full of it, trying to find out the origins of these people. But the actual project with the Lebensborn was to bring back supernatural powers, what were called electron powers by the originators of Aryan race theory, because the electron had just been discovered a few years before, around about 1900. And you find that if you then go and talk to a contemporary neo-Nazi, they've got no idea of the nonsensical fairy tales that began this. And they'll either be identity Christians or Wotanists. They'll have adopted this whole raft of bizarre ideas and become so convinced of these ideas that, like, say, Timothy McVeigh, they're willing to go and kill a lot of people. And
to die for it. But how many groups, John, have some version of that? That, if you follow certain whatever, you'll have superhuman powers.
So we mentioned macrobiotics before, and I was involved in macrobiotics when I was 17. And one of the interesting facts about macrobiotics is that George Osawa, who founded it, firstly claimed that it was a diet that came from Zen monasteries. It didn't. I actually talked with an abbot at a Zen monastery and got interested in that, very soon afterwards. But the other thing is that while mushrooms and tomatoes will kill you because they are much too yin, you can smoke cigarettes. Bizarre and conflictual ideas are married together.
Indeed, because people don't want to accept the human limitations, our existential crisis that we need to face up to, that we're not superhuman and we're flawed. and we have limitations. There's only so much we can accomplish. And, that's not a comfortable set of ideas.
Although,
so people are drawn. Yeah, go on, Rod.
Although I think a lot of people do accept the limitations, and actually sometimes, far too much, because, people have sort of self-stereotypes about the fact that they don't think they can do any better. But the kind of folk myths that you're talking about there, John, that inspired Nazi ideology, I mean, they exist across the political spectrum, and the internet and social media has just become a huge accelerant to that. So you see this weird concoction, like you were saying, weird hybridization of these ideas in conspiracy theories. And we need to remember that democracy, as we kind of understand it in the West, is very new. I mean, these are forms, if you think about, universal suffrage, how new that is. And in that sense, I think a positive message about the value of that, but also how fragile and difficult it is. Because, autocracy is relatively easy, to manage. Democracy is actually very difficult to manage because it does rely on issues of civic responsibility and people recognizing the part that we all have to play in that, and that rights and responsibilities in that sense go together. And these are not necessarily always very attractive messages when, there are much more sort of far-flung idealistic notions of how you can, whether it's a caliphate or whether it's a communist society, or whether it's the notion of the Third Reich, these utopian ideas. And I have behind me on my backdrop Frantz Fanon's quote about blind idealism being reactionary. And I truly believe that to be an important statement. And I've never quite completely believed the notion that the work that we do is simply about the deed and not the creed, because the way that people behave is inspired by what they believe, and it's circular. And so it's not enough just to critique the influence process. We have to understand what motivates people to do that, the beliefs that inspire them. And therefore, actually, we cannot just accept a free-for-all where we just say anything goes. We, I think, have to, lobby for something, argue for something. And for me, that's, notions of liberal democracy, civil society, and evidence-based science. And, I'm not going to apologize. And if people see that as imperialistic, then, that's an argument that we can have. But I don't accept this kind of relativistic melting pot in which really that's where extremism, for me, flourishes.
People who believe absurdities will be willing to commit atrocities. I think it was Voltaire.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And we do see it. I mean, with the postmodern idea that all opinions are equal. And I'm happy to admit that Einstein's opinions about space-time were far more developed than mine. It's that simple. And so witches must exist because what's his name, Gardner, invented it all in the 1940s. That too is an incredible thought that years ago, reading The Flight of the Wild Gander by Joseph Campbell, he puts forward the history of fairy tales and folk stories and explains that during the 19th century, when the Grimm brothers and the Finnish Folk Society came about, one of the first things they discovered was that within a generation, a folk story becomes traditional. So the one I always use to exemplify this is the man who's found searching for his key under a lamppost, which I've read in at least 4 psychology textbooks. It's in a Russian film made during the Soviet era. It comes up as a joke. And somebody comes up to him and says, "Oh, this is where you lost your key." And he says, "No, but there's no light where I lost my key." Now, this story is actually 12th century, 13th century. It's from the Mullah Nasruddin, a collection of Sufi stories. But it is accepted as a traditional story in cultures all around the world because it's survived for more than a generation. And the same with these dogmas, that the idea that we must believe something because it's in this book that our forefathers believed, we must be able to be skeptical. We must be allowed to question. I mean, in the Christian way, when Thomas doubted that he was seeing Christ, Christ said, put your fingers in the holes. So this whole idea of you must have faith, you must just believe in what you're told, is not even essential to the Christian message. That skepticism and fact checking is very important. What we are seeing is the algorithms of the internet sending people into echo chambers. So I've had this thing on my channel. There are these various conversations with this Australian guy, Andy Nolch, which was great fun. And he came to me saying that he'd had 8 years in Scientology and now he'd left, and he'd left because he'd seen my work, and would I do the last interview for him as he closed down his podcast. And so I, being a very gullible and innocent human being, did 6 hours of interviews with him without checking him out. And I was about to, I was going to put them up, but he gazumped me, put the first one up 3 days before David agreed, which meant that Tony Ortega, who notices anything that happens with Scientology within 10 minutes, wrote to me with his typical succinct, sententious approach, which was, do you realize what Andy Nolch went to prison for? It's like, okay, fine. And I then interviewed him about what he'd gone to prison for, which was drawing a giant phallus on the grass where there was going to be a memorial for a comedian called Eurydice Dixon, who had been raped and murdered in Melbourne. And Andy was arrested and given community service, and he then went out of the country, which he wasn't allowed to do under the court order. So he got a 5-month prison sentence. And he basically, a few months later, I decided not to put these interviews up, but he put them up. And a few months later, he put up this thing called John Atack Debunked. And I'm allowed to use the Australian accent because several Australians have complained that I didn't. Mm-hmm. And I've now realized that political incorrectness is the proper thing in Australia. So I'm allowed to use the accent. And at one point he sent me this thing where it had gone viral, and it's a talk by a guy explaining that the vaccines for COVID-19 are actually going to sterilize or kill you within 3 to 5 years. And it's gone viral. It's gone all over the place, this video. And the guy says, you know, I'm a PhD from Oxford, and this is what I think. And you dig a little deeper, you go, well, actually, Oxford, being a perverse place, doesn't issue PhDs. What does he mean? He's a PhD from Oxford. Oh, Oxford, Ohio. So he's a PhD from Oxford, Ohio. Okay, he's a PhD though. What's his PhD? It's in education. And this came as a response because I said to Andy Nolch, he'd said that people were being forced to be vaccinated. And all I asked him was, where is that happening? And the response was this video. When we check this video back, we find he's referring to somebody else's work. He's an educator who doesn't know anything about virology or epidemiology. And the guy who he's referring to actually was the man who first suggested the use of messenger RNA in vaccines. He didn't discover messenger RNA, but he suggested this in the 90s when he was working for a pharmaceutical company. He wrote a paper, the paper was published. But what you're not told is the paper was withdrawn because when it was checked, the references in it weren't true. Now, they should have checked that before publishing it. Then it's discovered, I think The Atlantic ran a piece on him, that he's no longer working in a pharmaceutical company because he was sacked. He's actually working in a chemist's shop. So we've got this one guy who's annoyed with the pharmaceutical company, who therefore makes up this story, which goes viral and becomes sufficient evidence for this position. And that's, you know, exactly where you're going, that things must be evidence-based. Yeah. And you've got to be able to determine the value of the authority. And, you know, this week sent me a thing saying there's a nurse in this hospital who's saying that this damage is being caused. And again, one person in a hospital, and let's all believe this. The gold standard in medicine is 1,000 people in a study. There must be a control group. And what's more, you've got to replicate it. You've got to do it again before you get
Absolutely.
reliable. So knowing who to trust and why to trust them, knowing how to discern that information is or isn't correct, becomes a very large part of how we are coercively controlled, that we're given information. You know, it's being called gatekeeping recently. Steve Hassan calls it information control, where the information we're given is restricted, where statistics are, you know, there are twice as many deaths from eating toffee as there were this year as there were last year, because last year one person choked on a toffee and this year two did. So it's doubled, you know. So watch out for the toffee. That these ways of looking at things, so which is the critical thinking aspect, which you're dealing with all the time. And then again, as you say, there's what binds us emotionally to things. You know, when I got into Scientology at the age of 19, I could already argue the back legs off a donkey. You know, I'd read the Symposium and various other things. I knew how to do what street epistemologists say they're doing these days. I knew how to reason. I could probably have gone into a law court and fought a case. You know, I had that kind of thinking. Didn't help me at all, because I was vulnerable, because I was incredibly distressed that my girlfriend had run off with somebody else. And why do you think about that critically? And I went to these people and they were really nice. They were really friendly, and they weren't trying to scam me. They weren't brainwashed zombies. They were really nice graduates from university who really believed that they had the secrets to share with me. And so it's that you become bound to the dogma because of the peak experiences you may have doing meditation or what have you, or because of the trauma that's inflicted upon you. You know, both ends of that work. Our friend Yuval Law talks about awe experiences, but he points out that awe can be terror as well as an ecstatic experience. And we become involved in groups. We become, you know, the group becomes the family. And you know, I don't mean in the sense of Charles Manson at this point, but the group becomes your, you know, you adopt members as your siblings, and the leader as your parent, and the dogma as the truth of the universe, which can then, as Robert J. Lifton says, eventuate in the dispensing of existence, the thought that other people don't deserve to live. And looking at the right wing in the US at the moment, these groups like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, it is shocking to me to see the irrationality that's necessary to preserve that much hatred towards other people. That, I think that's the part of it that really gets me, that we're patriots for America as long as you agree with us, but we will lynch you if, you know, even though you're, you know, born here and what have you. If you disagree with us, you're a libtard. You know, this anger that I think is very, very much to do with the trauma bonding that you're talking about.
Well, I think people are, going back to Linda's earlier point, I do think that people are driven by the need for meaning in life, and in that sense, a need for a mission. But also, you know, when I think about my own cult involvement, you know, railing against injustice and oppression, and people see that in different ways. Even though I was on the far left, I can also see how people on the far right also get into their politics with similar motivations, even though
I was certainly very idealistic. And when I joined Scientology, I was particularly annoyed with the effects of psychiatry on our society. One forever the cuckoo's nest approach, because I'd met people who'd had ECT. And so, yes, you want a better world. And I think many of us were recruited precisely because we were idealists who saw a corrupt establishment and wanted to change it.
And looking for certainty too, because I think the hardest thing in life, I think, is to live with uncertainty, and that's where, you know, extreme beliefs or ideals are very attractive. But I don't mean my comment about science to ever be misinterpreted as an advocation of secularism, because that's not my position. I always feel it's important to add this, caveat, because I think science can also, be illusory in terms of its certainty. That people want the hard facts, and facts are rarely hard, actually. And that's of course, the kind of relativistic spiral in which you can get into. It's just important to recognize that you have to live with uncertainty in the decisions you take every day, that you're making a balance of probability that something will work, or that you will survive the trip, or whatever action you take, and you have to learn to live with that. And that's where, critical thinking is also about understanding, I think, those heuristics, those dilemmas. And sometimes I think the difficulty is that if people are just overly critical, they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because they're then rejecting everything. So one of the things I've noticed, actually, is that you've got some really good critical thinkers who are, rejecting of the COVID vaccines because they're reading widely and they're using their critical. You can't accuse them of not being critical thinkers. It's exactly. Just that what they're not accepting is, like you say, where the weight of good evidence lies, one could argue, but also they're looking for certainty, when a lot of the time, certainty actually in many respects is an illusion. After all, we're made up of mostly of water with electrical currents running around in us, and we all live with a degree of uncertainty about what the next few seconds will bring.
Yes, and even when we get to physics, physics tells us that nothing is hard. Everything is spinning, and there are more spaces than there are particles. And that probabilistic thinking, I think, is a very important point, that rather than saying there's true and false, that there's actually a scale that goes from highly probable to highly improbable. And thinking along that spectrum, and being willing to I think it was Feynman who said that he had no belief that he wouldn't be willing to change in 5 minutes when presented with evidence. Well, it can take a bit longer than 5 minutes, but to be willing to not to be rigid in your thinking, and therefore, and again, what you say about secularism, I think, is very important. I'm an agnostic. I just don't know. Atheists attack me for being an agnostic. Theists attack me for being an agnostic, but I don't know. I do not know, if there was indeed a Big Bang. I don't know who had it. And we are now, as you get into the ideas in physics, of course, there is a lot of thought now that Big Bang is a single event within a steady state. So we've gone back to what the astronomer royal Fred Hoyle never ceased believing in. There is a steady state. The universe must be perpetual. It didn't have a starting point. It has a collapse point and then begins again. These ideas are absolutely wonderful, but they leave us, in the middle of this immense universe, so much bigger than the Christian or Jewish philosophers believed, that God must be huge, to be dealing with all of this. But I don't think it matters what people believe, or, maybe the world is on the back of a turtle supported by 4 elephants, as Terry Pratchett put forward. And I think Hindu scriptures also put forward. Maybe it is. It doesn't really matter. What matters to me is, what do we make of those beliefs? That the followers of Kali in India in the 18th and 19th century believed that to worship Kali, they had to strangle strangers. And that was their religious practice. So I think if your religious belief takes you to an antisocial practice, then it's not a good idea. Whereas if your religious or secular, whatever belief is founded in compassion and humility, that there is some chance of progress. I talk with a lot of people who have really lost hope. A lot of very clever people working in the same field with going, well, it's all, it's going to go bad. It's going to go wrong. And I actually feel relatively hopeful that we do have the tools to safeguard humanity. We do have the tools to change humanity, but those tools are not weapons. Those tools are ideas. Those tools are things that bring us to an understanding that I've just read a wonderful book called The Man Who Invented Nature, about Alexander von Humboldt. And there are more things named after Humboldt than any other human being, more rivers, mountains, fish, insects, because he, in the end of the 18th century, went to the Americas. He was born, I think, in Prussia, but in one of the German states, and was the first real naturalist. He was Darwin's hero. And he realized this thing, that everything is actually connected to everything else. So that if the priests in this community went down to the sea and got all of the turtle eggs and ate them because they were really yummy, there weren't going to be any baby turtles. And that if you logged all of the trees, and he's followed by a guy called George Perkins Marsh, who wrote a book called Man in Nature, in which he invented the word ecology. And I think most people don't know that echo in Greek means family. So ecology is the study of the family, and it's based in this idea that everything in the world is connected. And if you try and separate yourself off and say, we're Aryans, or, you know, we're Nation of Islam, or whatever, then something nasty is probably going to happen, that we need to be not nationalists and not pro our tribe, but we need to look at all of humanity. And I get in trouble for suggesting this, but I'm going to suggest it, that if we're to save the environment for future human generations, because the planet will probably manage without us if we don't, but if we're to save it for future human generations, we have to stop fighting wars. We have to stop using our resources in destructive ways. And the only way that I can see that that's going to happen is by spreading ideas about coercive control, because the propaganda that leads people into wars is fundamentally coercive control. It's like, you know, they can send out Saddam Hussein in 25 minutes can bung out a nuclear missile, which he didn't happen to have. And his range was, in fact, Tel Aviv. It was no further than that. And we saw with that just how willing people were to be persuaded. People at a high level who had the power, where 80% of the people in this country, a democracy, said, not in my name. There were enough people in the parliament that I think only Kenneth Clarke voted against the Iraq war. It was that bad, you know, that people were persuaded by propaganda, that when you trace it down, in fact, the information that military intelligence had came from two individuals who were both of them liars. I've seen interviews with both of them, and they made up stories so that they would be granted citizenship, one in Germany and one here. And they made up these stories. That the foreign minister of Iraq at that time was a US agent doesn't seem to be mentioned. They knew thoroughly well what was happening. But you get propaganda, you get deception, and you get an inability to stop that machine from going on, because we're living in a culture that is not doesn't respect human life. You know, the five permanent members of the UN Security Council are the five biggest arms dealers in the world, as the movie Lord of War tells us. And that is all, for me, bound up in coercive control, and in its basic form, which is deception, which is conning people with a hidden agenda into doing something you want them to do. What I'm saying, the corollary of that, is that what you're doing is incredibly important from my perception. And I applaud you for it. I really do. And
well, thank you very much, John. And thank you for contributing to our program by speaking to our students. We very much appreciate that.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, and I think, you know, thank you also for what you said. I kind of gave up when I left my groups, thinking I was going to save the world myself. But at the same time, I think it's nevertheless important to recognize that we can all do our bit, can't we? And actually, that's the point, that empowering everyone through a quest for learning and a quest for reflection and critical thinking everywhere, and that people around the world are all just as entitled to that. Yes. That's my pause for thought as to how you get beyond warfare without letting many millions of people die while that's happening. I say that because there was a debate about whether we should intervene against the Third Reich originally, as should there be a war there? And my personal view is that was the right thing to do, because actually, even though lives were lost, nevertheless many lives were also saved. It's a check and balance. It's messy, it's difficult. That's the problem with democracy. It's not straightforward. It doesn't provide you with that certainty. But one thing I am certain of, that the work you do, John, I've done for many years, provides huge benefit to many, many people. And, I'm proud to call you a friend and a colleague that we love working with. So thank you for inviting us to talk with you today.
Yeah,
great.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Let's end the recording and carry on talking in secret where nobody can see us. I'm John Atack, Linda Dubrow-Marshall, Rod Dubrow-Marshall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.